Hello guys, it's Lewis and welcome to another revision video. Today I'm going to be covering statutory interpretation of the law AQA specification. Firstly, there are 3 rules and 1 approach to statutory interpretation. And you need to learn all of these and examples for each. And the disadvantages and advantages. So firstly, we have got the literal rule. This is when, here is a valid definition of this rule. If the words are clear, they should be given their literal/ordinary meaning, even if the result is absurd. You put that, and then you've got the definition marks in the back. So, cases, we have got LN ER v. Berryman. So I'm just going to read out this case, guys, and then you can just make notes and summarise the case yourself. Right, defendant was oiling the tracks. The judge decided that oiling was not relaying or repairing, it is maintaining. This went against a statute that stated, widow shall be awarded compensation if husband or wife, spouse, is killed repairing or relaying the tracks. Therefore, the judge decided that the widow would not receive any compensation for the death of her husband. That is LNER v. Berryman. You don't have to worry about the date, but the date is 1946. Another example is Fisher v. Bell. Defendant displayed flick knives in his shop window. S59 Offensive Weapons Act 1959 made it an offence to sell any offensive weapon under the contract law. A display in a shop window is not an offer to sell, it's just an invitation to treat. The defendant was not found guilty, but even though the Act clearly stated that such behaviour should be stopped. But since the literal rule was used, the defendant was found not guilty. So that is Fisher v. Bell, and the date was, even though it's really insignificant, 1960. One more example of the literal rule. Whiteley v. Chappell. The defendant impersonated a dead person and used his identity to vote in a general election. And that made it an offence to impersonate anyone entitled to vote. The defendant was not found guilty since, literally, a dead man is not entitled to vote, and therefore the defendant did not commit an offence. So that is Whiteley v. Chappell, and that happened in 1868. Right, now for the advantages and disadvantages. There are some advantages and disadvantages that you need to remember for each rule, like I just said earlier, and don't worry though, because all the advantages and disadvantages for each rule are really similar. Right. Anyway, the advantages for the literal rule. The rule follows the words of Parliament, that is 1. Prevents unelected judges from making law. Makes law more certain, since you are following the statute literally. Makes more understandable and easy for it to be applied by judges. And another one you could put is it's easier for lawyers to advise clients, since it's easy to predict the literal rule and how it will be followed. Disadvantages. It assumes that the Act was written perfectly. There are not enough laws to cover every single situation, and therefore it leads to uncertainty. It follows the law/statute specifically, and Parliament use specific words, and therefore it can lead to an absurd result. And the acts that the literal rule follows are usually dated, and therefore the acts cannot really make valid results in court, and therefore lead to absurd results. Right, that is the literal rule, and now on to the golden rule. So a valid definition for this rule is where the literal rule produces an unjust or absurd result, the meanings of the words can be altered within the context of the statute to avoid an absurd result. So that is basically the definition. There are two types. It consists of two different approaches, the Gullah Rule, the narrow approach and the broad approach. The narrow approach is when the words have more than one possible meaning, and the broad approach is when the word only has one possible meaning but it produces an absurd result. Right, so again we need to have some cases, and if you are going for just a clear answer, just include two cases. But if you are going for a sound answer, like you should be, include 3 examples. But I say 2 examples explained well is sound. 3 examples explained decently should give you a sound as well. Anyways, right. R.V. Allen, yes, sorry. Defendant was charged under under the OAP Act 1861, which made it an offence to marry when you were already married. There are 2 meanings of the words to marry. The first meaning is to be legally married, and the second is to go through a ceremony of marriage. The defendant argued that he was already married, and the second marriage could not be valid. If the first definition of the words to marry was used, it would have created an absurd result. Therefore, the second definition was used to make sure that the defendant was found guilty. So the judge applied the second meaning of the word to marry. Another one. That was R.V. Allen, 1872. R.V. Sigsworth, 1935. The Administration of Justice Act gives the power to cancel the next of kin assumption if the next of kin has murdered the victim. In this case, the son had murdered his mother, and his mother did not make a will, and therefore the murderer / defendant would have been rewarded compensation and therefore benefited from the murder that he had committed. The judge obviously found how absurd this was and did something about it by using the Gullah Rule. So the judge added words to the statute. So therefore the Administration of Justice Act was created. Right, so that was R.E. Sigsworth, 1935. And now Adler v. George, 1964. The official Secrets Act 1920 made it an offence to be found in the vicinity of a prohibited place or near a prohibited place, but the defendant was arrested inside the prohibited place. And he argued that he did not commit an offence, so the court decided to add words to the statute, and the words that were added were in or in the vicinity of. To ensure the defendant was found guilty, the court used the broad approach. Right, so that was Adler v. George, 1964. Right, the disadvantages and advantages of the Gullah Rule. Advantages. Respects the words of Parliament except in limited situations. Creates an escape route if the literal rule does not work or leads to an absurd result. It allows judges to choose more sensible meanings for words, which lead to more appropriate court decisions, and therefore assuring that justice is being served. Disadvantages. It can go against Parliament's intention. It's very limited in its use and cannot be used in every case. It's hard to predict when the rule will be used, and therefore it's hard for lawyers to advise clients. And it is defined by Michael Zander, a feeble parachute, meaning it's an escape route but not a very good one. / cannot do much. And they are the advantages and disadvantages of the Gullah Rule. Now for the Mischief Rule. The Mischief Rule, a valid definition for this one, as the rule was set out in the Hayden's case in 1584 and gives judges more freedom than the other two rules, and the rule looks at the gaps in the law that Parliament was trying to remedy or fill in. Cases: Smith v Hughes. So, SI Street Offences Act 1956 states it was an offence for prostitutes to solicit in the street or in other public places. The defendants, which were prostitutes, were inside a house and tapping on the window or the balcony of a house, waving to attract attention, therefore soliciting men on the streets. The defendants were still found guilty even though they were not soliciting in the streets, since the Mischief Rule was used. The judge decided that the Parliament's intention was to clean up the streets, no matter if the prostitutes were on public land or not. Therefore, they were found guilty. So that is Smith v Hughes, 1960. The Royal College of Nursing v DHSS, 1981. The Abortion Act, 1967, said an abortion must be performed by a registered medical practitioner or doctor. Yeah. Abortions at the time were done through surgical procedures. By the 1970s, medical advancements sprang, and most abortions were performed by nurses, therefore not doctors. The Mischief Rule was used by Parliament because Parliament was trying to prevent the harm caused by illegal abortions carried out by unqualified people. As long as the abortions were carried out in a hospital by qualified medical staff, it did not matter if they were doctors or nurses. So that is the Royal College of Nursing v DHSS, 1981. Oh, and now we've got one more example. The Eastbourne Borough Council v Stirling, 2000. The defendant, an unlicensed taxi driver, was waiting for passengers in a station forecourt. The defendant was charged by applying for hire in a street without a licence, contrary to the Police Clauses Act 1847. The court used the Mischief Rule and looked at the problem with the act. The act was supposed to solve. Even though the defendant was parked on private land, he's still likely to get customers from the streets. Therefore, the defendant was found guilty. Right, the advantages and disadvantages of Mischief Rule. Advantages: it allows judges to look at the gaps and decide Parliament's intentions. Fills in gaps in the law and therefore can be used in future cases. The Law Commission approves the Mischief Rule and says it should be used in every case. Allows judges to interpret what Parliament meant at the time and convert it to the present, since I said earlier that the literal rule uses really old acts that are really not useful now in the present, and can be used to avoid an absurd result of the literal rule. Right, and now for disadvantages. There is a risk of judicial lawmaking which can be biased. It fills in gaps in the law, but the gaps are filled more opinionatedly than fairly, and it can make law unfair and therefore unjust results could lead to in future cases. It can lead to uncertainty in the law if it's hard to convert to the present. It cannot be used in more general consideration of the purpose of law. It is not always easy to discover Parliament's intention at the time. And last but not least, we have got the purposive approach. This is the modern version of the Mischief rule. It focuses on the purpose of the Act, and the judges decide what Parliament meant to achieve when the Parent Act was passed. Judges mainly find out what was Parliament's intention when they created the statute. Right, so there are 3 cases again that we need to remember. We've got Jones v Tower Boot Co. A plot worker was being physically and verbally abused by his colleagues. The victim wanted compensation from his employer. The Court of Appeal had to decide that the behaviour of the other workers fell within the course of their actions. Under S32, the Race Revelations Act, if it did, the employer would be found liable and would have to pay compensation. The employer said it did not, and that racist behaviour was not part of the job. The court decided that Parliament's intention was to eliminate discrimination from the workplace. Therefore, the employer was found liable for the acts of his colleagues, his employees. This was the only way of achieving Parliament's intention. So that's Jones v Tower Boot Co. 1997. The Secrecy of State of Health, 2003. The House of Lords had to decide if organisms created by doing techniques came within a definition of an embryo in a Human Fertilisation Embryology Act, 1990. Embryo was defined in the Act as an alive human embryo where fertilisation is completed. The House of Lords used a purposive approach to decide the purpose of the Act of being to protect human embryos no matter how they were created. So that's RV Secrecy of State Health, 2003. RV Ex Parte Smith to 1990. The Adoption Act stated that an adopted person over the age of 18 had the right to be given a copy of their birth certificate. Smith was a convicted murderer who lived in a mental asylum, and he was over the age of 18, and he wanted a copy of his birth certificate. Doctors said that they believed that Smith would try to kill his mother if he discovered her identity. Using the literal rules, Smith would have been entitled to have a copy of the birth certificate, but the judge decided to use the purposive approach because it could not have been Parliament's intention to promote serious crime. In the view of the risk of Smith's mother, the judge therefore refused to allow him to see the birth certificate. And they are the cases. And now for the advantages and disadvantages of the purposive approach. Advantages: it leads to justice in individual cases. It is a broad approach which allows law to be covered in more situations than applying the words literally. Useful when there is technology involved, and which was unknown at the time when the Act was passed. It gives judges more discretion than using the literal meanings of words, and it allows judges to avoid the literal rule if it leads to an absurd result. Disadvantages of the purposive approach: judges refuse to follow the words of Parliament. How do judges know the Parliament's intentions? And it leads to uncertainty in the law since Parliament's intentions aren't always clear. It allows unelected judges to create law and alter the law. It is difficult to discover Parliament's intention at the time. It's difficult to predict when the purposive approach will be used in court, and therefore it's hard for lawyers to advise clients. Right. I'll just run through the aids to interpretation. There are 2 types of aids, internal aids and external aids. I believe there are 6 internal dates that you need to remember, and there are 7 external dates that you need to remember. Right, internal dates then. These are the materials found inside the Act. The title of the Act. So the statute consists of 2 titles, long and short, and they can be used to interpret the Act. The preamble sets out the purpose of the Act, which can be used as well to interpret the Act. Definition section. This is a section of the statute which defines the words inside the statute. Punctuation. Punctuation can change the meaning of a sentence. For example, panda eats, shoots and leaves, and the panda eats, shoots, then leaves, or and leaves. So just put a comma after eats and it's a completely different sentence. Subheadings, these indicate the subject matter of each section. Schedules, extra information essential to the Act. External aids, dictionaries, they can be used to find the literal meanings of words, therefore dictionaries are great for using for the literal rule. Legal textbooks, these can be useful for judges to find the point of law. Other statutes that relate to this statute could be useful to interpret along with the statute that you are interpreting. Explanatory notes, these are notes used in previous cases by other judges, which can be useful as well, since the statute has been interpreted before. Case law, and previous cases when the judges have considered the meaning of words in other statutes. Law Commission reports, highlights the existing law and suggests changes. These are in these reports, which can be useful for interpreting acts. And Hansard, which is very rarely used, but these are this is like a record of Parliament's discussion in houses, and can be used to interpret acts, but Hansard is usually used in emergency situations. And that is it.